Hello! Alrighty, everyone. My name is Joe Nash, and I don't have access to my keyboard. There we go. My name is Joe Nash, and I'm here to talk to you today about principles for asynchronous working. I myself have been remote and asynchronous since 2013 at a variety of companies that are where I worked remote and asynchronously for different reasons. At some of those, it was because I was traveling a lot. At others, it was because I was part of a globally distributed team, and at others, it was just because of the fact it was a remote-first company. And of course, in more recent times, it's because increasingly we are all remote and asynchronous thanks to the ongoing global situation. And so this is increasingly a way of working that we need to learn to adapt and excel in. And so I'm here to share what I think are some useful lessons in working asynchronously that I hope will serve you well in your working life. So let's start by talking a little bit about space and time. And what I want to talk about here is what is the difference between remote and asynchronous? What do we mean when we say we are working asynchronously? Well, when we talk about remote, we're primarily talking about physical separation. That's not working in the same place. So we might be all working from home, but still in London or New York, all in the same city. We just don't share an office. And that imposes some differences on the way we might work and the way we might collaborate with each other. But it is a far different thing to working in time separation, where we're not working at the same time. And when I say not working at the same time, I could mean something like we're working in complete different time zones. I'm here in the Netherlands, you might be in another country, and we might be separated by physical distance as well as time. But I could also just mean that we don't work the same hours. You might have to clock off at 3 o'clock to go pick up your kids. I'm not online around 10 o'clock because that's usually when I have to walk my dog. These kind of things, that, are part of real life that affect the way we work, that is another aspect of time separation. And it is that latter that we're here to talk about today, asynchronicity. Asynchronicity is different to working remote. They both impose different challenges. Working asynchronous tends to support working remote, but when people say they work remote, they don't necessarily mean they work asynchronously. And so it's important to keep that distinction in mind. If you're applying to a job that says it's remote first, do they mean they are asynchronous or just that they don't have an office? So we're going to be talking about asynchronicity today. Here is some JavaScript. Excuse me for putting some JavaScript on your screen. This is an asynchronous function, and I want to ask you, why is asynchronous programming important? Why do we think about asynchronicity in our code when we do when we write code, when we do technical things? Why do we care about asynchronicity? Well, that's because asynchronous operations do not block other operations. When we are doing something asynchronously, other threads, other processes, other things in our program can continue to happen and can continue to execute and deliver their work. And that is the same principle when we are working asynchronously. We care about working asynchronously because we don't want to block people in their day-to-day work. We want to make sure that everyone is equipped with everything they need to do their work and to deliver, and that we have everything we need to do our work and deliver. So how might people be blocked in their day-to-day work is a question that we need to ask to get to the root of how we work effectively asynchronously. So the question I want you to ask yourself right now is, what do you need to do your day-to-day work? What is it that when you sit down at your desk for the day, you're like, okay, do I have the things I need to complete my tasks today? What kind of things might you need? Well, to jump through a list of some things that I think are important, you may not have had all these answers, but I'm sure some of them will have occurred to you. We need 4 big groups of things. We need context, we need permission, and we need materials. Sorry, that's 3, not 4. We need context, permissions, and materials. What comes under context? Well, we need to know things like who is working on a project, who is involved with this particular piece of work I'm delivering, what is the work I'm delivering, what is being done, what is the history of that project, when does it need to be delivered by, you need to know when your deadlines are, why is it being delivered, what is the important, why am I working on the thing I'm working on, how is this thing to be produced, how am I meant to be working on it, and what has worked or what has been tried in the past, what do I need to keep in mind as I'm going about my own implementation of whatever it is I'm working on. Then we need this vague topic that I call permission, but you could equally call this trust. You need to know that you are trusted to execute on the work. And this is really important asynchronously because you are often working independently because you're not in the same time zone as someone else, or because you're not working at the same time as someone else. You can't constantly say like, hey, is this right? Am I doing this correctly? Is this what you had in mind? So you need trust in order to be able to work asynchronously. And it's arguably one of the most important, but also most empowering aspects of working asynchronously. And along with that comes authority. You not only need to be, you not only need to know that you're trusted to execute the work, but that you have the authority to make changes on the fly. If something changes in the project, you can't sit there waiting all day for your boss or someone else to come online to approve the plan. You need to have the authority to be able to make those changes. Consensus is part of this. Everyone agreeing and knowing what the plan is really important to providing both trust and authority. If you're not sure that you have consensus from your team, i.e. if everyone involved in the project is not in alignment on the structure, I can't believe I said the word alignment. If everyone in the project is not in agreement on how the project is being executed, it's hard to derive trust and authority. And then precedent is really useful for this. So knowing what has happened in the past, knowing what decisions have been made in the past, help inform how you make decisions in the future. So precedent can lead to trust and authority. And then finally, you need the materials to actually execute the project. You need any past artifacts. That might be existing code. That might be, assets, and also things like templates in the case of documents, things that have been developed through the institutional knowledge of the company, right? Things that have been that you can build upon to deliver your own work. And all of these things you may not necessarily think of when you're working day to day. They might just exist around you. They might just permeate the company. But when they're not there, they're instantly a blocker. If you are the only one working right now and you don't have authority to make a decision change, it's a blocker. If you're the only one working right now and there's an asset that you don't know where it belongs, that's a blocker. If suddenly you don't know how something is meant to be implemented, that's a blocker. So we want to make sure that these things are always available for everyone working all the time. So another question for you folks, where do you get this information? Those things that we spoke about, where do you find those when you're doing your work? Where do you go to look for the history and the context surrounding the project? Where do you go to find out what the group has agreed upon and what the consensus on the direction of the project is? If your team members are offline and you are the only one working, how do you find this information? And more importantly, where do you provide this information? As you are going about your work, you are generating these artifacts. You are creating the history of the project and the institutional knowledge of your company, and that's going to be needed by someone else down the road, whether it's your colleague in a couple of hours from now when they woke up and you go offline, or whether that's someone long after you've left the company and someone else has to pick up your work. Where do you make this information available and communicate things like trust and consensus so that you can be non-blocking? Well, if you don't already know the answer to that, we're going to get into some best practices for doing that with some quick fire best practices, some things that I call principles. These have kind of been reverse engineered. These all have very authoritative looking titles. I have made them up. I have tried to think about what has worked at previous remote first companies that I have been at. Some of those places had very successful asynchronous cultures that were very particular to the way that company, the history of that company, and so it's hard to replicate. And so I've tried to choose the best bits that worked for those companies, but that might be relevant for you no matter how your company works or is formed today. So let's go through some best practices and talk about how you can be non-blocking and how you can encourage your colleagues to be non-blocking. So my first and most favorite one is put a URL on it. Another way to explain this is if it doesn't have a URL, it didn't happen. And what we're trying to do here is encourage everyone to take information, to take things that are generated spontaneously or to take spoken word and to record it somewhere where it can be shared, right? If something has a URL, it can be shared and it can be found. And that's super important because it, first of all, enforces documentation. If you have a conversation, that's just a conversation, but when you write it down somewhere, it now has a URL. So by ensuring that everything that happens, every decision that is made has a URL, you are naturally enforcing documentation. As I mentioned, it facilitates sharing. It's far easier for people to get hold of stuff if you are producing things in a way that provides for easy sharing, right? Even Slack messages are a good example of this. You can link people to other Slack messages, and that allows you to link to a Slack thread and say, well, here's the discussion that happened last week. Google Documents, GitHub Issues, all these things facilitate sharing through the existence of URLs. It builds the web, it builds the institutional knowledge. As you put URLs on things, you can reference those things in new documents. You can start to connect documents together and build through this tree of referencing so that someone opens your project brief or they open a GitHub issue you've been working on, they see the things that you're referencing and they start to know where to look for the context, for the consensus. They have this web of institutional knowledge that is available to them because everyone is putting a URL on it. And then this is just straight up quoted from a GitHubber called Ben Bolter, who we'll talk about more towards the end. But if you answer a question more than once, write it down. And this is just, in general, good practice for life. But if you are asked a question by a colleague, if you are finding something's repeatedly asked in a Slack channel, write it down somewhere. Just go stick it in a Google Doc, share it. Really useful way to make sure that any institutional knowledge that lives uniquely with you is distributed around the company and isn't siloed in you. So next up, this is a really useful heuristic for working out how you can make sure that the artifacts you're generating are available to everyone. And that is by asking yourself constantly, where are the search boxes? In my company, where do people go to search for things? Is that Google Drive? Is it Slack? Is it whatever your company uses? Is it the GitHub search bar? You should be search aware whenever you create something. And this is particularly true if you're using tools that other people in your company don't necessarily use. If you're producing Airtable sheets or Miro boards, how does someone who doesn't have a login to those services find the knowledge that you have created in that document? So always be checking whenever you're using anything, hey, how might other people expect to find this? Where might they look for this? If they don't know it exists, that's the key thing. If someone doesn't know that a document actually exists, but they suspect that knowledge exists somewhere, how might they actually find the document? Where might they search for it? This is also links into how does someone who's not even aware that someone at your company does your job, how would they find it? What terms might they search for to say like, hey, I wonder if someone at this company is looking after XYZ. What terms would they search for? What terms would someone who's not on the inside use to find that knowledge? Make sure you include those in your titles and in your content so that it appears in search bars. And that leads on to what is important to the search engine. Unfortunately, a lot of us work in institutions that use Google Drive, a piece of software made by a search company that forgot how to build search engines. And so sometimes we need to remember that software is going to make it very difficult to do things. And we need to actually shape our documents in a way so that the information we want to be exposed does get exposed to the search engine. And this can mean sometimes setting really obvious, really weird titles and having very particular title formats. It can mean making use of metadata in fun ways, but just again, understanding the software that you're using and how it influences how people find knowledge is really important. And then this one is another really key one, which is defaulting to open over private places. And I'm sorry, this is a direct call out for all of you who spin up a Slack DM with 5 or 6 people whenever you want to discuss something. Thinking about the search bars, thinking about where we get knowledge, we want to default to open spaces, open channels, because they are discoverable and indexable. There's a lot of psychological safety in doing a DM, in doing a direct message and creating a direct message thread. But we want to make sure that knowledge doesn't disappear when that DM is archived. So create a channel rather than start a Slack DM. It feels really messy, it feels really unneat, but it means that conversation is shared with anyone who's using the Slack search bar if it's a public channel. You should default to open where possible. This will vary depending on your company situation. Some companies have a higher security environment where you can't have permissive sharing settings, but if you can, default to open where possible, because again, it makes it easier for everyone to find that knowledge when they need it and not have to ask for it. And if you are someone who defaults to private communications or to more locked down documents because you want to avoid drive-by feedback, which is unfortunately more common for some demographics than it is for others, use a feedback framework. I'm a big fan of the 30, 60, 90 framework. You can look that up on a website called Urban Engine. It basically sets out guidelines for what kind of feedback you're accepting. And I start all my documents with hey, I'm looking for 30% feedback, or I'm looking for 60% feedback, or I'm looking for 90% feedback. And then I link to the framework. And it lets people know that if they're viewing that document, there's certain types of feedback I'm just not interested in right now. So it helps me know that if someone stumbles onto my work accidentally, that I'm not going to suddenly be beset by drive-by comments. And then obviously if you're defaulting to open, be aware of personal, user and confidential data. Don't go, sticking a spreadsheet with all of your customers' data on the most permissive settings, accidentally leaking it. This is a better strategy for team discussions or for project designs, this kind of thing, than it is for other types of data. On the topic of psychological safety, over-communicate and overcompensate is just a key one whenever you're using text-based communications. first of all, you don't want to assume that the reader knows what you're talking about. If you drop into a Slack channel and continue a conversation that's happened elsewhere, remember that that user who's coming to that conversation may be coming to it at a different time. They may be coming to it from a different task. Basically, the conversation hasn't been continuous. Always assume that some time has passed. So try to add context to your messages wherever possible, so that anyone reading it at any time can understand what's going on without having to have been there, right? If someone is context switching, it's hard to keep up with the conversation. And then overcompensate for tone, because, and this is something that is found endearingly to be true. When I joined a company in the past, someone said to me that it's much easier, this was a remote first company, someone said to me that it's much easier to understand what people mean when you've heard their voice. And this has always rung really true for me, because I worked with a colleague for a really long time, and for the first year of working with that colleague, I thought they hated me. Like, I thought they were angry at me all the time. Their messages seemed really terse. They seemed really like I was annoying them. It just seemed like we weren't getting on well. And then I met that person, and they were just, a great colleague. They were a lovely person. They were really sensitive. They were really caring. They worked really hard to make sure everyone on the team had everything they needed. And just being able to read what they were saying in their voice suddenly shifted basically the way that I felt about everything they'd sent me in the past. So if you are working with someone who you haven't met face to face before, which is increasingly common, overcompensate. Like, do they know how you speak? Emoji bomb it. Really lean into it. Really try to make sure that, if there are feelings attached, or if you anticipate there may be feelings attached to this message, just straight up say that. Like, hey, I appreciate, that this is out of the blue, or this may be scary. Here is why I'm asking, that kind of thing. Now, all of the things I've said are really hard work. It's a lot of extra thought every time you send in communication. It's a lot to do and a lot to think about. So there are some tools out there that generate all of this kind of for free. So try to look for tools where this stuff comes as a byproduct. So for example, GitHub Issues is actually a system that does this really well, because when you're communicating in a GitHub issue and then you go and change some code, that change gets brought into the conversation and can be tagged into the conversation in time. So everyone who views it can see the conversation about the code, and then they also actually see the change happening, and then they see the conversation continue. There are other tools that are really good at this, and there are some tools that are really bad at this. Again, Google Drive is unfortunately a tool that's really bad at this. Comments in Google documents are where context goes to die. Like, if you do anything as a Google document comment, it will just disappear into the ether. So try to look for tools that produce good discoverable knowledge, and it will make your life a bit easier as you go. And then finally, no one is async unless everyone is async. If you have a team that's working really hard to be async, and then some members of that team go off and have a face-to-face meeting and they don't document it, suddenly that knowledge is lost. Someone has to have a synchronous meeting to get that knowledge and to get everything on track, and it all just crumbles and falls apart. It's all very fragile. And part of making sure that system stays resilient is to play finders keepers. If you find some knowledge that's undocumented, if you find something, if you one day you're working and you don't have something you need, congratulations, you're now responsible for making sure that knowledge is discoverable for everyone else. You need to be the keeper of that knowledge and share it with the rest of your team, and take something that's synchronous to being asynchronous. And it means challenging the defaults. Honestly, trying to make sure that everyone stays asynchronous is really important. As Naomi kind of covered in her talk, there's lots of benefits to meeting properly and to not meeting at all. If you're doing updates, there's lots of reasons why not meeting can be better for lots of teams and lots of contexts. And sometimes keeping everyone async, keeping the team async, means that you need to be the one to stand up and say, do we need to have this meeting, or should this be a document? Or do we have an agenda for this? And that kind of thing. And that can be uncomfortable, and it's definitely work that should be shared. And if you're finding that work is predominantly falling on certain members of your team, that's something that needs to be challenged as well. But unfortunately, it's very necessary. And kind of the summary of all of this is write it down. I love this quote from Leslie Lamport, one of the creators of the LaTeX writing system, which is writing of nature's way of telling us how lousy our thinking is. And this isn't to say that, if you're someone who doesn't excel at written communication, or you find writing your ideas down really hard, this isn't a call out of you. What this is saying is that sitting down and actually expressing our ideas to ourselves, whether that be in writing or whether that be in video or audio, is something that is a process that a lot of us don't do before we book a meeting, right? We tend to have an idea and want to, bat that back and forth with someone, but often actually taking a moment to ourselves and preparing and thinking about it reveals lots of problems that we would have kind of exported onto someone else. And this is one of the great things about asynchronous working, is that you really start to develop a skill for kind of rubber ducking yourself at every occasion, for revealing where your assumptions lie, for revealing problems in your processes, and kind of shifting to a much more coherent way of expressing your own ideas. So I'm writing it down. Again, we're looking for things that are indexable and searchable. Writing is hard, so don't think that don't be afraid to record a video or to record audio. Kevin is a great one at using audio transcription to send messages and things. And if you are sending audio or video, remember it still needs to be indexable and searchable. So you want to get your thoughts together before you record that video so that it's a coherent video and produces a good transcript. And you need to make sure those transcripts are shared in the places where the search bars are, so that people can find that content via search and not have to watch a whole video to get the context. A recording on its own is not sufficient. So I know that I'm running short on time, so some quick fire challenges, some things you're going to run into trying to do this at your company. Here are some specific challenges. Where is the source of truth? Where, if you had one place in your company where all the knowledge lives, where is that place? Chances are it's 8 different places behind 8 different logins, and that's a nightmare. Try to condense to as few source of truths as possible. Which tool does the information live in, and do you have access to it? Making sure that everyone on your team has access to where the knowledge lives before you start sharing that knowledge is really key. Who's the owner of knowledge? This is really important for knowledge forming out of date. And how do you find that teams exist? Again, where are the search bars? Documenting how you work with someone is a really important part of asynchronous working. This really cuts down on those kind of like aimless meet and greet sync meetings. A practice from GitHub that I really miss is every team having a README that said what the team did and how you can work with that team. Highly encourage you to kind of create like a team API. Who is this team? What do they do? How can you work with them? When asking yourself whether you should do sync or async, you should watch Naomi's talk and question why you're meeting, whether this needs to be a meeting. But if that fails, you can always jump to the wonderful blog post by Ben Bolter, Why Async, at ben.bolter.com, and then that blog post. Take a photo of the slide. If it's one thing you screenshot this slide. Ben Bolter is a fantastic documentarian of GitHub's culture, and GitHub, for all of its faults, has had a really fantastic remote and asynchronous culture. And Ben has years and years and years of blog posts about how GitHub works asynchronously and how GitHub communicates. And this more recent blog post is probably one of the best explanations for the inclusivity and work culture benefits of working async that you will ever find. If you have any colleagues who are in doubt about the benefits of working async, or you yourself are not convinced, highly recommend you read this post and then dig into Ben's other content and start to use that as you question whether we should be meeting synchronously or asynchronously. So that's it from me. I've been Joe Nash. Thank you so much. Happy working when other people aren't.